Hello everybody, it's your favorite West Virginia in space here, or should I say cyberspace, because, oh yeah, we're in the simulation. I guess Elon Musk was right the whole time. But, it's not that bad. I'm sure everything's made out of code and glitches, oh great, the glitches are happening again. Yeah, it's a minor problem, definitely not a tragic problem with the theory or anything. Okay, let's just drop the pretenses here. Here's my thoughts on the simulation theory. Now, to those that know me more personally, I don't believe in the simulation theory. I don't believe our reality is a simulation or a computer game or anything like that. I just don't. It's a personal opinion based on my beliefs and view of the world, and of course, I don't have definitive, facts-based evidence that will single-handedly disprove the simulation theory. But I can give my opinions like everyone else can on this subject, and I think I will today. So, what I'm going to start off with as a basic, of course, disclaimer, though, is I'm not going to go into the details of the simulation theory in the sense that I'm going to explain it to you. Because there's no way you found this video and don't know about the simulation theory. And if any concept I bring up you just don't recognize, then please feel free to find another video that talks about it. Because there are some very good ones out there that cover this way better than even I could want to. So, now we're going to jump right into it. One of the most common ones I've seen is people saying that they're trying to simulate their own past. That we are the simulation of the past of some advanced human future civilization. And though this makes sense on the surface, it runs into problems. Mostly because a lot of people say they're trying to replicate their own history, which I just don't think makes sense, because if you know your own history enough to build a simulation to simulate it, why do you need a simulation to simulate it since you already know about it? I could make a slight exception for alternate history stuff where they're trying to test history with certain different parameters, which, I could kind of see, although I still think they could be done with a way simpler simulation that doesn't require creating, 8 billion or so conscious individuals trapped inside a machine. That seems like a bit excessive to me. But, I'm not an advanced civilization, so what do I know? Although, of course, that would require a lot of processing power, I imagine, which, this is the problem with a lot of simulation theories, is a lot of them require stupid amounts of processing power to get reality as accurate as we see it. Remember, as a person who studies video game design occasionally and such, and stuff like that, just because something acts like gravity doesn't mean it is gravity, and that's going to apply to any other force. You can mimic something relatively well, but if you try to process it accurately, it becomes a nightmare. And those little differences people can tell. It's just that when you play something like a video game, you're trained not to notice these. But we'll get back to that. Another one, which sounds like the same thing but slightly different, is that we are in a video game. We are like The Sims or some video game type thing. And I just don't really buy that one either for a slightly different reason. A Sims example doesn't make sense to me because if you ever play games like The Sims, people make some really weird, quick snaps in judgment that just don't make sense because people are controlling them in that sense. If we're assuming we're NPCs or something, and you just don't see that in people often enough for me to buy it. And if we're all the players in the game, why are we playing exactly? I know this sounds weird, but why the heck are we playing this game that lasted for this long? Now, obviously, we could go into whole last Thursdayism, but that's a whole different discussion I don't want to get into right now. But it does lead to a question of, if this is a video game, why the heck are we playing it? What happens in life that is so intrinsically interesting that you want to play as a normal person in it? And it's not an insult to life, it's just me asking an honest question. When we make video games, we make ones with action, adventure, or going on this or that detail, and there's a reason a lot of it cuts down the boring bits. Even in something like, say, a relatively chill dating game, you don't have the sections where someone goes to the bathroom because that's just not entertaining. No one wants to do that kind of stuff in a video game because, well, part of it's time reasons, but you have to ask, why does our reality conform to this conception? It just doesn't really make sense to me. Also, if there was a video game, there is no way someone wouldn't have toggled on cheats by now. Trust me, every video game, even the most mundane one, has some stupid random stuff that can happen in it for no discernible reason. And though reality, as we know it, has a lot of weird stuff we don't have perfect explanations for, they don't really come off to me like that. Now, that's highly subjective, but it's always been something that kind of bugged me. And I know people say, they could load a previous version of the simulation. And granted, that kind of makes sense, but if you've ever paid attention to when you load or resave a game, especially if it's a really complex one, things start getting weird. This is actually a well-known thing where sometimes, especially in older games, save data would kind of corrupt and do this kind of weird thing where it's things would remember things that didn't actually happen, especially if you use stuff like mods can sometimes occur. And granted, I have seen people use that as an explanation for the Mandela effect, but I also don't find that to make a whole lot of sense either because, Mandela effect, a whole nother, we could just discuss another time. But ultimately, I just don't find the evidence of us being in a video game very convincing. The only explanation I've seen kind of make sense is one that Isaac Arthur, from that YouTube channel Isaac Arthur, put forth the idea that it's some kind of training simulation so people don't get too decadent in the future, so they had to spend the first 20-ish years or a whole lifetime inside a modern world that isn't barbaric in their eyes, but is still harder than the almost paradise they have in the future. I don't believe that either, but I think, honestly, because I think it's still kind of weird because not everyone's life is set up in a way to give them this kind of experience of humbleness. I don't know. But once again, I think it's the closest, but I just don't buy it. But ultimately, I don't think it comes down to any kind of logical argument. I don't think people who believe in the simulation theory are, generally speaking, being terribly logical about that. At least not in the way they think they are. So let me go into why I believe that on that. But I think to get to the bottom of that, I think it's best to start with why people believe the simulation theory, which I think is something people don't really talk about enough. Now, I think the largest group of people who say they believe in the theory just believe it because someone they view as personally smart said it, like a scientist or a philosopher or whatever. And, well, that's just not really someone who's thought about it terribly deeply. They just think, smart person has said it, so I shall believe it. And I'm not really trying to be insulting there, but that is kind of the logic behind it. They don't really think about why they believe something. They just do it. And people do this for a lot of other things. I just think the simulation theory is one where it's quite common. However, the people who more deeply think about it, I think another one that's I think it's worth saying, honestly, that the simulation theory is, for all intents and purposes, kind of a spiritual practice. Now, a lot of people have said it's a religion, and their claims are now quite real because it does fall into a lot of religious practices and tendencies that would make sense to call it that. But I'm going to call it a spiritual practice, except when I mess up and call it religion. But ultimately, I think I'm going to try to call it a spiritual practice because I don't think it's a fully fledged religion, more so a belief about the universe that would be more classically put into spiritual practice. That's a whole lot of word salad that basically just means nothing, or it does, but you know what I mean. But ultimately, I think it does because it in many ways does operate like a religion or spiritual practice like that because it has the whole view of a higher plane of existence. It views our world in a mixture of we are all just we're not the true world, there's the higher world, and then there's a mix of Gnosticism thrown in there, I think, whether intentionally or unintentionally, I'm not entirely sure. Oh, and a ton of Matrix stuff. There's a ton of Matrix stuff. I don't think I have to explain that. But ultimately, and I don't actually care if people view the simulation theory as true, obviously, but I think it's interesting that it in many ways operates like one. It operates like a spiritual practice. Now, a lot of people compare it to an afterlife, but I just don't see that. Most simulation theory doesn't really go into what happens if you die in the simulation. A few vaguely mention it, but most don't. So I don't view it as really an afterlife type of scenario to them, because it just doesn't make sense. What I view it as is people, in some ways, trying to find a higher version of reality. For humans, for all of our history, for the most part, and most spiritual practice religions across the world, we believe there's a higher plane of existence. In Christianity, it's heaven. For the Greek gods, it was Olympus or Elysium, etc., etc. Most religions have this higher plane of existence, this higher world of spirituality. And I think in many ways, the simulation argument is a modern, more scientific version of it, if you want to call it that. I think now granted, you could argue why people view this. Is it because we instinctively know there's a higher plane of existence? Is it some kind of comfort mechanism? I don't know. But I do view it as a kind of variation on this concept. Now, because a lot of religions will use what they understand to explain this higher world. And it isn't so much as necessarily part of their religion necessarily as a teaching thing, but as a way to understand it. I would use heaven as a good example here, where we don't always have the best idea what it looks like, but we use stuff we understand to help explain it to ourselves, if that makes sense. I think it is a modern version of the higher plane of reality, just with how we view science today. I do wonder, though I do call the simulation theory more of a spiritual practice than a religion, I do wonder if the simulators, the people who are supposedly running the simulation, will become like the new god or gods if this becomes a full-on religion down the line, which is a whole thing that could become a massive question that is just an interesting thought for another day, probably. But of course, I'm no philosopher or no guru or no scientist that could give you some great kind of answers. I'm just a guy on the internet that likes talking about stuff that interests him, and who knows, maybe I'm actually just a puppet of the simulation here to keep you off the beaten path and make you believe you're not a simulation. I'm not, but you don't know that. I mean, I'm not. Don't get that idea, please. But either way, I hope you enjoyed this video. Do you think I'm right? Do you think I'm wrong? Please explain down in the comments, like, comment, subscribe, and all that jazz. And I'll see you all next time. Yeah. Hey, why don't you hit that sub button? You're gonna become a subscribble. Get to see my content quicker. Wouldn't that be nice? I bet so.